Welcome to the third episode of our weekly El Monitor webinar on the Israel-Hamas war and its impact on the region. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of El Monitor. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel is ready for a ground invasion, that the day has been set. That El Monitor's Ben Caspit reports today that there could still be a delay because of U.S. preparations in the region and a possible deal for some of the over 200 hostages, including around 10 Americans still held by Hamas in Gaza. U.S. President Joe Biden has said he has not told Israel to postpone its invasion plans, but he also continues to counsel restraint in its approach to the imminent land war, while continuing to emphasize the need for a post-war vision, including a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Casualties are increasing from Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. There are now more than 7,000 Palestinians killed, in addition to 1,400 Israeli deaths since the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th. The U.S. has sent one of its top counterterrorism experts, Marine Corps General James Glynn, to advise Israel on the ground operation. The U.S. military, meanwhile, has launched airstrikes this morning against two facilities it said were used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and affiliated groups in eastern Syria, responding to a series of recent local attacks on U.S. forces by Iran-backed groups that have injured 21 U.S. personnel since October 7th. To discuss all of the latest on U.S. policy toward the Israel-Hamas war, we are joined today by El Monitor State Department correspondent Elizabeth Hagedorn and El Monitor Pentagon correspondent Jared Szuba. For those viewing our webinar, please submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Jared, let's start with you. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said a date has been set for the ground war. As I mentioned at the start, Ben Caspit writes today, maybe not, there could still be a delay. We've seen two preliminary short incursions into Gaza by Israeli forces this week. What do we know, or what do we think we know at this point about the timing and scope of the Israeli invasion?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. The reality is we don't know anything about the timing and the scope of the Israeli invasion because it initially looked imminent, but this is likely to be the most complex operation the IDF has ever pulled off or attempted in its history. You have seen reporting recently that the Israelis have agreed to hold off for some time, at least until the U.S. can get additional air defenses and an additional aircraft carrier strike group to the region. U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf, roughly 30,000 of them, slightly less, in that region, are significantly within range of Iran and its proxies and their projectiles, which U.S. air defenses are able to knock down. But this is a real threat, and U.S. military officials are taking that seriously. So I'm told that in the last hour that the USS Eisenhower could get to the region within, quote, a couple of weeks from a current U.S. military official. So whether or not the Israelis and Netanyahu's war cabinet have the patience for that remains to be seen. It does seem the Americans are counting on the promise of the release of more hostages, or the potential for that, to sort of stay the incursion, build a little bit more time. At first it seemed that the IDF didn't seem to have terribly much interest in getting to these hostages. It raised concerns with the U.S. that the Israelis didn't have a plan for the day after. But you did see, I believe it was today, Benny Gantz, former defense minister and member of Netanyahu's war cabinet, say that now hostages are a top priority for the IDF. And that's a significant shift. It does seem that the U.S. Advising and influence is working. Now, there are probably a couple of different options the IDF has here. If they want to eliminate Hamas entirely, including its political officials, they're going to probably have to go for a full-scale incursion. Military analysts, former U.S. officials are saying this. This is pretty well understood. If they're willing to curtail their objectives, as some have reported, including Ben Caspit here at El Monitor, and go for maybe the top one, top two tiers of Hamas leadership, take them out. There are potentially other ways to do that operationally. One potential alternative would be to send in sort of armored mechanized columns to seize key terrain from which to launch further raids on high-value Hamas targets. That would be a lighter footprint approach than a full-scale invasion and occupation of Gaza City. Of course, the full-scale invasion is likely to trigger an Iranian and Hezbollah and Iranian proxy reaction. The Iranian proxies around Israel, well armed with precision-guided missile kits, drones, particularly Hezbollah, have in the Iranian foreign minister, you saw yesterday issuing a warning in New York that their red line has not changed on this. So if the Israelis want to achieve a slightly curtailed objective, there are other options for lighter footprint. If they want to go really light, though, they could start with special operations raids. This is what U.S. military officials, current and former, have suggested to me, and likely what Lieutenant General Glynn is advising them on. Special operations raids, light footprint, go in, kill a few targets, gather some intelligence, pull out, piece together that intelligence over a series of those raids to build a clearer picture of what Hamas leadership networks look like, where they are, where their infrastructure and their munitions are, and then send in, with their support, more focused raids to take those out. That's the lightest approach. That's the approach the U.S. has quite a lot of experience with. Former military officials have said, particularly in the war against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and the war against ISIS. It is also the riskiest in some ways because you have forces exposed. And of course, as General Votel noted in a think tank event, former CENTCOM commander during the war against ISIS, noted earlier this week, the adversary Hamas will continue to observe those movements, and they will learn and they will adapt quite quickly. So that is a risky option. It's the lightest footprint and arguably the one would hope least likely to trigger a regional reaction by Iran and its proxies.
Jared, I'll come back to in a few minutes on the regional piece. But Elizabeth, let's go to you. One of the priorities for the Biden administration has been to get American citizens out of Gaza. I think there's approximately 10 left, but you can correct me on the numbers. And also concurrently secure aid deliveries from Egypt. Some aid is coming in, but there have only been 2 Americans released so far, and additionally 2 Israelis. Help us understand how all this comes together and the contrast between a humanitarian pause, which seems to be what we're involved in now, to allow aid in and allow time to get hostages out, as opposed to a ceasefire, which is increasingly advocated by other countries and critics of the Israeli act.
Thanks, Andrew. You're right. A lot of the focus this week at the State Department has been on getting aid into Gaza and getting American citizens out, both hostages and those who were living in the Gaza Strip prior to this outbreak of war. As far as the humanitarian assistance is concerned, thanks to a US-led diplomatic push, we've seen limited amounts of aid trickle in through the Rafah border crossing, but far more is needed, especially fuel, which the Israelis rightly fear could be diverted by Hamas for military purposes, but which aid groups say is desperately needed to power hospitals and desalination plants. So to that end, as you referenced, Blinken for the first time on Tuesday, I think, backed a humanitarian pause in the fighting to allow for increased aid delivery. Notably, just a week ago, the U.S. used its veto on the Security Council to defeat a Brazilian drafted resolution that, among other things, called for humanitarian pauses. At the time, the U.S. said it took issue with the fact that that resolution made no mention of Israel's right to self-defense. So as of this week, the U.S. is now calling for these pauses, but stopping short of calling for a ceasefire. If you're wondering what the difference is, U.S. officials would say a pause would be limited in terms of its duration and scope. So think Israel holding off on bombing near the Rafah gate so that aid can pass, that sort of defined humanitarian mission. Whereas a ceasefire is more about stopping the fighting so that the warring parties can negotiate. At this stage, the U.S. views a ceasefire as something that would only benefit Hamas and undermine Israel's right to fight the militants. But of course, there are growing calls in the Arab world, not to mention from within Biden's own party, for a ceasefire. Now, at the same time, the U.S. is pushing to get Americans and their immediate family members out of the Gaza Strip. There are an estimated 600 Americans, nearly all dual citizens, who were living in the Gaza Strip. Many, if not most, have registered with the State Department, indicating that they want to leave. Their only way out as of now is via the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. That's the only exit point not controlled by Israel, and it remains shut to evacuees. Authorities in Egypt have received the names of Americans, I'm told, and according to the State Department, Egypt, after some delay, is now ready to receive them at Rafah Gate. The problem, according to U.S. officials, is on the Palestinian side of the border. At times, there's been no one from Hamas there to physically open the gates to let the Americans pass through. And at other times, the State Department has had reports of armed militants actually blocking the exit. So it's a chaotic situation, complicated by the fact that, as I've experienced talking with some of these Americans in Gaza, internet outages and electricity outages in the locations where they're sheltering is making it very difficult for them to communicate with the State Department, and for the State Department to inform them when it is safe to move, when the Rafah border crossing will be open for them to evacuate. So right now, the focus in Washington is on getting the message to Hamas through partners like Qatar, like Egypt, that Hamas needs to let the Americans leave. That's a priority for the new U.S. point person on the humanitarian crisis, former Ambassador David Satterfield. My sense is we'll have some movement on this in the coming days. But, just to kind of close out on this, I've spoken with a number of Americans who are waiting near the border with Egypt, who are desperate to get out, who are there with their families. They're terrified. They moved further south after the State Department advised them on 2 occasions that the crossing might open. And as one American told me, he said, if the US government can't get us out of here in a week's time, I'm going back to Gaza City. He said, if I die, I'd rather do it in my own home.
Jared, the U.S. has ramped up its capabilities in the region. You talked about that. And it's also sending a powerful message to Iran to stay out of the conflict. Iran, however, already seems to be escalating the conflict via its proxy forces in Iraq and Syria. How concerned is the U.S. about further escalation? What is the U.S. prepared to do if Iran and its proxies continue to target American forces?
U.S. officials in the Pentagon are very concerned about this. I mean, this is a priority for them, the protection of U.S. forces. You saw that there was a threat by what is likely to be a front group online from that is linked to the IRGC. I believe it was earlier this week, threatened that U.S. bases in Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates will also come under attack, in addition to the U.S. positions and coalition positions in Iraq and Syria, if Israel continues its war in Gaza. U.S. officials are taking that threat seriously. I'm told by folks in the region as well as here that is something they're taking seriously. That supposed group has claimed previous attacks and has had demonstrated foreknowledge of attacks, particularly on the United Arab Emirates drone attack in 2022 and on Saudi Arabia on the Royal Palace complex the year prior. So U.S. officials are taking those very seriously. You saw the Houthi cruise missile and drone attack last week, which the USS Carney intercepted. That revealed that the Houthis have cruise missiles which can range Israel. U.S. officials believe that the targets that the Houthis were aiming for were actually in southern Israel. So that's a clear warning from Iran and its proxies that their red lines are serious, and again, that were underscored by the Iranian foreign minister in New York at the United Nations yesterday. Whether or not U.S. Forces will come under direct attack immediately is not clear. There might be a bit of a wiggle room in the escalation ladder here. You might potentially see further attempted attacks, as we've seen in the past, on commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf, particularly on tankers that are linked to Israeli officials or Israeli In the past, it's been Israeli businessmen. So that might be further room in the escalation ladder that would be short of triggering an all-out regional conflict. Yeah.
Elizabeth, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Barbara Leaf is in the region. It's probably not a stretch to expect that Secretary of State Blinken will be back soon for another round of shuttle diplomacy. Tell us about the administration's engagement with our Arab partners in the region, especially Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. They all seem to be playing an important role. And how is the U.S. keeping our partnerships together, given the rage and outrage in the region regarding the Israeli attacks on Gaza?
Thanks, Andrew. I think for Biden, this war will serve as a defining, if not the defining moment of his foreign policy legacy. So much is at stake. We saw that in his historic wartime visit to Tel Aviv. He's talked with Prime Minister Netanyahu nearly every day since, and those diplomatic efforts continue with Secretary Blinken, who made a whirlwind trip to the region and is today meeting with his Chinese counterpart in Washington, where he's expected to press Wang Yi to use Beijing's influence with Hamas's chief backer, Tehran, which we can get more into. And as you mentioned, Assistant Secretary Barbara Leaf is in the region on a diplomatic blitz of her own, asking U.S. partners to have it to use their influence with Hamas. I expect we'll see continued shuttle diplomacy from senior State Department officials as this war drags on. Multiple objectives here: aid deliveries, getting AMSITs out, as we mentioned, ensuring minimal Palestinian casualties that, as you referenced, are inflaming tensions in the Arab world and creating strains with U.S. partners. And then, another big priority is the release of the hostages, and that's where Egypt and, to a greater degree, Qatar have played a significant role as interlocutors. Blinken spent several hours in Qatar during his regional trip, meeting with both the Emir and Prime Minister. We know that hostages were high on that agenda, and that's because Qatar is not only one of the main donors to Gaza, but for more than a decade has hosted Hamas's political office in Doha. So it has significant leverage and lines of communication with the militant group. It also has a long history of facilitating deals between the US and groups like the Taliban, more recently Iran. We see that experience in mediation has started to pay off. Hamas has released 2 Americans, a mother and daughter, who were both dual citizens. That was a week ago today, as a result of Qatari mediation, in what some, I think, interpreted as an effort by Hamas to engender some goodwill from the US as it advises Israel, as Jared mentioned, on a counteroffensive that could put the hostages at risk. As you said, there are 10 US citizens who the admin is saying are unaccounted for. The assumption is that because it hasn't confirmed their deaths, they're most likely held captive. Were Israel to delay its ground invasion, that would buy more time for talks over the hostages. And obviously, time is of the essence. Hamas claimed yesterday that hostages have died in the airstrikes. We don't know if that's true, but what we do know is that they've threatened to kill the hostages themselves over Israel's bombing campaign, linking a ceasefire to the hostages release most recently. They're saying that they need time to locate and release the hostages, and they can't do that amid the airstrikes. President Biden, for his part, has said it has to be the other way around. No ceasefire until the hostages are out. And you can, assume that is definitely part of the conversations that are ongoing between US officials and their counterparts in the region.
Just want to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions. We've already gotten into some of them already via the Q&A function on Zoom. Jared, let me come back to you. There's a question here about, again, around escalation. Tell us a little about the Israel-Lebanon front, the possibility of escalation with Hezbollah, and what the U.S. would do in that case. Israel has had a policy of deterrence with Hezbollah. It's held up. It seems to an extent to have held up so far. The skirmishes between Israeli and Hezbollah forces have been limited to right around the border. How do you see it playing out, and what are you hearing from your Pentagon sources about that contingency?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question here. I mean, by far the most heavily armed and capable and experienced of Iran's proxy forces in this conflict are Lebanese Hezbollah on Israel's northern border. Hezbollah has significant experience. Many of their fighters have also gotten combat experience in the Syrian civil war. So that's a serious force, and it's formidable. And there are real questions and doubts within the Pentagon as to whether the IDF can handle successfully and fight and win a two-front war, both in Gaza against Hamas and against Hezbollah at the same time. So ultimately, the major risk of escalation in this conflict lies with Hezbollah and their decision-making, and the extent to which they have distinct interests from Iran and the IRGC is something a lot of people are worrying about right now. I will note that this deployment of the aircraft carriers and the U.S. long-range strike capability there are questions as to whether or not that's going to successfully deter sort of the pinprick attacks of rockets and drones in Iraq and Syria, especially if they spread to the Gulf region. But the Pentagon officials are really counting on those aircraft carriers to deter, in particular, Hezbollah from going all in on this conflict. Whether or not the U.S. will get involved if Hezbollah does so has been the subject of disputed reports. The president seemed to deny some of those reports on his way back from the region last week, but it's been coming out in quite a few outlets that that threat has been transmitted privately by the United States.
Elizabeth, let's stay on the subject of Iran. We have a question here about how the current Israel-Hamas conflict affects the Biden administration's policy toward Iran, especially when prior to October 7th, there seemed to be negotiations underway for a post-JCPOA, less for less nuclear deal. You've covered this, that sought to keep Iran under the nuclear threshold. Tell us where this all stands. And we're seeing here in the United States that many critics of the Biden administration, Republican critics in particular, have said that the arrangement between the U.S. and Iran, the $6 billion in frozen funds that were released and apparently not spent or allowed to be distributed at this point, could have been a sign of a failing policy in Iran and a sign that our approach to them was misguided.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of criticism in recent weeks. Just a month ago, the U.S. reached that deal with Iran to release a group of Americans in exchange for Iran getting limited, restricted access to $6 billion in its frozen oil revenue. And one of the criticisms at the time was that it freed up other funds for Iran to provide support to Hamas. We do not have evidence of that, but the concern that money is fungible was always there, and it's a criticism that we've seen levied at the administration in recent weeks. However, I think following some of that criticism, we now know that the U.S. has reached a quiet understanding with Qatar to prevent Iran from tapping into those funds, even if only for humanitarian use. And yeah, I mean, to your point, it's notable that just weeks ago, we were writing at Al Monitor about the administration's efforts to tamp down tensions with Iran to possibly reach an understanding over its nuclear program. As part of that effort, there had been a lull on attacks in U.S. forces by Iran-backed groups. Those months of painstaking indirect negotiations, it seems, have all gone out the window. Just today, the U.S. Imposed new sanctions targeting Hamas, but importantly, targeting its representative in Tehran, as well as members of the IRGC who have lent training and other support to Hamas.
Jared, for you, also a similar or related topic. There's been a lot written about the intelligence failure in Israel regarding the timing and scope of the Hamas attack, that Israel was taken completely by surprise. What about in the United States? Has there been discussions here about whether U.S. intelligence missed the boat regarding Hamas, Iran, and Iran's proxies in the region?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's also worth noting that for a very long time, for a while now, the U.S. has largely outsourced its intelligence gathering in the Palestinian territories to the Israelis. So an Israeli intelligence failure in Gaza is very likely to influence a subsequent U.S. alleged failure in terms of predicting or understanding what Hamas is specifically planning. I think a big part of this too, which has also been widely reported, is that Hamas seems to have kept its plans for this operation incredibly secret. I mean, even from some within its own ranks and senior leadership until the very last minute, some of the fighters have reportedly said that they didn't know what they were going to be doing until really just before the operation. We ran a story from a contributor in Baghdad who interviewed several Iraqi militia officials affiliated with the IRGC who expressed disappointment, if not frustration, with Hamas for going all in on this operation without consulting with the other factions that are backed by the IRGC in the region. So it seems to be Hamas's success through operational security also caught its partners in the region and its friends in the region off guard, and is furthering the reluctance or ostensible reluctance among some of those other factions.
Elizabeth, Biden has continued, President Biden, I should say, has continued to refer to a two-state solution as part of the post-conflict plan. It's unclear how advanced talks are regarding the post-war conflict situation, especially in Israel. But what are you picking up about how the administration is thinking about the post-war situation in Gaza?
You're right that President Biden said this week that he would redouble his efforts to reach a two-state solution. I think some critics would say it's a little too late. This administration has voted far less energy than some of its predecessors in the peace process. Its Mideast policy is really centered on, re-entering the nuclear deal, but also the expansion of the Abraham Accords and a U.S.-Saudi defense pact, rather than a serious effort to get the Israelis and Palestinians to sit down at the table together. I think, often regional diplomats I spoke with said it felt like the administration was managing moments of crisis between the two sides rather than trying to solve it. And, part of the reason for that, and this was something that Assistant Secretary Leaf and I discussed at the summit, the Al-Monitor Semaphore Summit in New York last month, was that the administration felt the conditions were nowhere near ripe for peace talks with, a right-wing government in Israel, the Palestinian Authority viewed as useless and weak. There was polling earlier this year that found support among Palestinians and Israelis, that support among them for a two-state solution had reached record lows. Despite what the administration is saying kind of publicly about recommitting to a two-state solution, I think it's hard to imagine in light of current events that would change anytime soon.
Jared, there's a question here about American capabilities in air power in the region. F-16s are part of the force being deployed in the region. Tell us what's expected from these forces with regard to deterrence, and why is so much more force needed given our bases in Qatar, in the UAE, Kuwait, and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think we touched on that briefly before. I mean, I think the two carrier strike groups bring an overwhelming amount of force to bear in terms of not only intelligence collection that can be provided to the Israelis, but also long-range strikes, naval to land if necessary, air operations. The Americans have also sent the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit aboard the Batons, USS Batons Amphibious Ready Group. That was already in the region and is now potentially being redirected to the Eastern Mediterranean, possibly in preparation for the possibility of non-combatant evacuation operations, should those be ordered by the White House. So the display of force is intended not to escalate the crisis, but rather the opposite, to basically send the signal to Iran and its proxies that they should not get involved in this conflict. I mean, the Pentagon couldn't be clearer on this. The Iranian red line, ostensibly, and its proxies' red line, is the continuation of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, and particularly an Israeli invasion of Gaza. That is irreconcilable with what the early stated objectives of the IDF's campaign are. The purpose of putting that amount of force, U.S. force, in the region is to basically convince the Iranians that it's not worth getting involved in this fight. Now, whether that'll work or not is going to depend a lot on how the Israelis decide to carry out their campaign. Iran has built at least a three-front bulwark around Israel of these proxies, and Hamas is a key part of that. If Hamas is wiped off the map, if its military capabilities are destroyed, as the Israelis have said they want to do, Hezbollah is the second major Iranian proxy force on Israel's border. In any future war between Israel and Hezbollah, the IDF will be able to concentrate its forces on Hezbollah without having to deal with a Hamas threat to the south. So that may be the thinking now in Tehran, that if they lose Hamas, their whole three-front strategy is missing one of its cornerstones. So that is certainly something that we should be taking seriously.
And Jared, a very just quick follow-up question from one of our viewers. So does that mean that if Hezbollah enters the conflict in an impactful way, the U.S. is prepared to take action and intervene directly against Hezbollah?
Yeah, again, I mean, I mentioned that's the million-dollar question. We simply don't know. U.S. officials, the president has cast doubt on some of those reports, but there have been reports both in regional and international media citing regional officials that the Americans have sent that signal. So we'll see.
Elizabeth, question for you. A State Department official resigned last week or in the last 2 weeks over concerns about U.S. policy toward Israel. You broke the story about State Department listening sessions that Secretary of State Blinken has been involved in with Jewish and Muslim American employees at the department. Tell us what you're picking up in terms of feelings about U.S. policy in the region. We see some divisions within the Democratic Party in various constituencies. Is that occurring also at the State Department, or was that resignation more or less an isolated incident?
Well, Andrew, I think just in the way the war has divided this country, there are divisions within the State Department. It's a big building. There is serious frustration among some over what they perceive to be an approach that favors Israel over Palestinian civilians in Gaza. We've seen the resignation of the State Department official you reference, who, in his resignation letter, called the administration's surge of weapons to Israel short-sighted. I think he said it was kind of a reflection of blind support for one side. He's not the only one that feels that way. We know the Huffington Post reported that U.S. diplomats are drafting a dissent cable that's meant to be an internal channel for officials to privately express their concerns. One staffer told me that the internal frustration he feels is reminiscent of what was seen in the lead up to the Iraq War. Now, Blinken has taken notice of this. He's personally sought to reassure employees that the administration's approach is balanced. That began with a letter that he sent upon returning from his trip to Israel and the region, in which he acknowledged had been, I think in his words, both a challenging time professionally and personally for many employees. And then the next day, I reported that amid the tensions, Blinken held so-called listening sessions with representatives of employee organizations within the State Department for Jewish, Arab, and Muslim staffers. So he's trying to convey to his workforce, I hear you. Whether that's enough to assuage folks who, fundamentally disagree with the policy, I think remains to be seen.
Jared, we've seen a number of attacks coming in Syria. Tell us about concerns about that front in particular, and also if you could comment as well on how you mentioned the report that Al-Monitor had on Iran-backed armed groups there. How are we seeing those theaters and flash?
Yeah, so again, I mean, the U.S. has about 900 troops in Syria in the aftermath of the Defeat ISIS campaign. They're spread out at several bases, but largely concentrated in the northeast of Syria, largely alongside the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, as a local Kurdish-led alliance of militias. The reason they're still there is because there's about 60,000 former ISIS members and their family members in detainment camps and prisons in that region with no clear sign of international tribunals or war crimes tribunals for them. So the U.S. simply really can't leave. That's why they're there. Now, they're also potentially vulnerable to rocket and drone attacks by Iran-backed proxies, particularly on the western side of the Euphrates River. These proxies have drones and rockets, obviously, many of which are believed to be supplied by the IRGC. But some of these attacks you've seen recently appear to have emanated from Iraq, from across the border. That would explain some of the phone calls, the flurry of phone calls you saw between Secretary Blinken and the Iraqi Prime Minister, Mohammed Shia Sudani, and Secretary Austin and Sudani over the past week. The Americans are putting pressure on the Iraqis to crack down on this and to prevent attacks on U.S. forces in both Iraq and Syria. The degree to which the Iraqi government and Iraqi security forces can contribute to that is a major question. U.S. forces have obviously been injured. That's been reported. That some of those symptoms of their injuries include potential traumatic brain injuries. A red line for the U.S., of course, is the death of U.S. personnel. You did see the death of a U.S. military contractor, a civilian contractor. Last week, the Pentagon said it was as a result of a, quote, cardiac episode after U.S. personnel at the Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq's Anbar province sought shelter amid what turned out to be a false alarm on the early warning system. So that you did see the U.S. respond with airstrikes last night authorized by the president. The Pentagon is emphasizing that these airstrikes in response to these attacks are not related to the Israel-Gaza war, that if Iran-backed factions want to claim that their attacks are part of the Israel-Gaza war, which they clearly are, that's fine, but the U.S. is not seeking to expand that conflict into Iraq and Syria. U.S. forces are not there for that reason. They're there for the defeat of ISIS and to prevent ISIS's return. There are also additional benefits, of course, as we've reported over the years, for U.S. interests and strategy for the presence of U.S. forces there. So particularly in that part of the region, the U.S. is really trying to keep that separate from the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Elizabeth, a further question about negotiations around the hostages held in Gaza. You had mentioned that the Rafah crossing, is there not also an Israeli crossing, Kerem Shalom? And you mentioned the important role of Egypt and Qatar. Are there any other interlocutors? For instance, Turkey has a relationship with Hamas, also has a relationship with the United States and Israel to some extent. Have any other parties gotten involved, or is it basically the Egypt and Qatari channels?
My understanding from the State Department is that those two countries are the lead players here. You mentioned the Rafah crossing, and I see we had a question about why isn't there consideration of Kerem Shalom, which is an Israeli-managed crossing, being used to get Americans out. And I think we should distinguish between getting the hostages out and getting the AMSITs who just lived in Gaza out. The hostages, I think that's kind of put them in a different basket. The international, the Red Cross, they're involved in facilitating their transport. That's kind of separate. But as far as just getting regular people out of Gaza, it was hard enough, I think, to convince or to work with the Egyptians to give them the security assurances they need in terms of getting the foreigners out of Gaza. It's of course a concern on the Egyptian side that there could be Hamas infiltration should there start to be mass evacuations, that militants could slip through the border and into their Sinai region. So, I mean, that alone is like one piece of the puzzle. That's kind of how a State Department official described it, as like, it's one big puzzle. And every time they unlock one piece, so like they get the Egyptian part figured out, then they've got another problem, and that's on the Palestinian side with Hamas. I think it was hard enough figuring out the Egyptian component, given, what we're seeing from the Israelis. I can't imagine there'd be a scenario where they would open up Kerem Shalom. I will say the State Department spokesperson was asked about this yesterday on the record. He was asked, is the U.S. exploring other options? And I don't want to misquote him, but I believe he said something like, we're looking at all possibilities. So I guess I wouldn't rule it out. But my sense is that is not on the table or a priority right now.
And no discussion that you know of regarding Turkey being involved in any of the negotiations?
Not that I'm super familiar with. I would note that Secretary Blinken was not in Turkey during his visit to the region, nor is Barbara Leaf stopping there on her trip. That could change. They referenced there might be additional stops, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Good. Well, we are out of time. In fact, we've gone over time because of many great questions, great answers from our correspondents. I want to thank All Monitor's Pentagon correspondent Jared Szuba, our State Department correspondent Elizabeth Hagedorn. Those of you who are not currently signed up for their newsletters, Jared does the security brief every week. Elizabeth does the takeaway, fantastic reporting, as you can see here, and analysis. Thank you both, and thank you all for joining us today. We'll be back next week with another installment of our webinar series on the war.
Thanks.